Welcome, everyone, to the general session with the Federal Transit Administration. I'm Adelie. I'm a member of the executive committee at APTA, and I'm also vice president at TransDev and serve as the chief strategy officer for the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority. That's a mouthful, but that's there'll be a test later on, so please remember.
And I'm Kevin Quinn, and I'm a member of APTA's board of directors. I'm also the administrator and CEO at the Maryland Transit Administration in Baltimore. We'll be co-moderating this session, which features remarks by FTA Acting Administrator Jane Williams about the transit projects and initiatives that affect all of us here today.
And then we'll go straight into our Q&A session, where you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of the Acting Administrator Williams, as well as some of her leadership team who are here in the audience. So please make sure that when we get to the Q&A phase that you make your way to the mics. There are 2 mics in the room so that we can recognize you and call you to the podium or to the mic to answer your questions. So with that, let's move right to the main event, and we will ask for Administrator Williams.
I'll just jump in real quick and note that she has a very distinguished career in transit and public service. And I had the pleasure of working with Jane while she was the director of Washington Area Transit Office at the Maryland Department of Transportation. And in that role, she managed Maryland's investment in the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, WMATA. She also worked with transit services to coordinate grant agreements and state aid in 2 of Maryland's most populous counties.
She also previously served in the federal departments of Energy, Labor, and Interior. And now she helps oversees over 500 employees at the Federal Transit Administration, and she is over $13.5 billion in annual funds that are used to support public transportation. Acting Administrator Williams will talk about the FY18 budget, omnibus appropriations, and the recent additional funding that has been provided for public transit. We'd like to thank her, the FTA, the DOT, for the many projects that they have continued to fund and have received funding over the last several months, and many of the grant programs that have been announced. So please help us now welcome Acting Administrator Williams.
Apparently they already have me mic'd, so I don't need those. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Adelie and Kevin, for that introduction. I believe that's the first time I've had a tag team introduction yet, so thank you for that. And it's also always a pleasure to share the stage with a fellow Marylander out of MDOT, one of the best DOTs in the country. I'm not impartial or anything. But thank you for having me today. I understand I'm the last thing before you wrap up today, and it is beautiful outside, so you get an extra A+ for being here. And I also want to thank Nat and Paul for the opportunity to be here, for inviting us here, and also for your leadership at APTA. 2 of my members of my leadership team are with me here today, and you'll hear more from them in a little bit. The first one is Henrika Buchanan. Henrika has served in many roles at the FTA, most recently agreed to serve as my acting chief safety officer. She's the 2nd highest ranking career official at FTA, and I appreciate her guidance on a daily basis and her flexible thinking. She brings a lot to the table, and I'm so fortunate to have her with me at FTA. I also have my regional administrator, Dr. Yvette Taylor. Many of you from this area know Dr. Taylor very well. She led the emergency efforts for 2 of the 3 major hurricanes that struck last year. And so I know she is a very familiar face to many of you. We also have a number of other FTA staff here with me as well to help participate in the session if you have questions. And so they're seated here in the front row, and when you get in the weeds, I'll be calling on them to answer some of your questions. So thank you again for being here today. It's my first APTA Bus and Paratransit Conference, and it's an exciting time to be a part of the field. And I know you are as optimistic as I am about the future of the industry. You know, prior to joining FTA, as Kevin mentioned, I served as the director of the Washington Area Transit Office for MDOT, one of FTA's largest grantees. And while there, I had the opportunity and the honor to work with Secretary Pete Ron and Governor Hogan. And having that opportunity to serve in those uniquely prepared me for the leadership that I'm taking on today. It was not one of my own making, but is the one that I have. And so it's great to be here to see you all firsthand. Many of you I've been able to meet with while I've been in DC. And so I appreciate the opportunity to hear from you. One of my hallmarks has been to listen. And so let me just be clear, that has not changed, and that will continue. One reason the industry keeps me so optimistic is because it continues to innovate. I had the honor of accompanying the secretary last year at APTA's annual conference at the Expo in Atlanta. And with innovation as one of her top priorities, along with improving safety and rebuilding infrastructure, she was very anxious to see what the industry had done in innovation firsthand. And so it was just a unique honor for me to actually accompany her on that expo floor. And we both left there thinking, wow, we should have spent more time there. It was something to see. And she really enjoyed learning specifically about all the different innovations the industry is doing and how they impact bus service, rail service across the country, paratransit service. To think that just 3 years before at your previous expo, there was only one all-electric bus on the floor. And yet in Atlanta, there were more than a dozen. It just shows you how quickly the industry is changing and innovating. And so I'm proud that FTA fostered much of that research. They helped bring this new technology to fruition, moving it out of the laboratory and onto the street. 2 weeks ago, as many of you probably know, we published the funding opportunity for funding for this year's low and no emissions vehicle program. Many of you are familiar with that program, and this year it received an additional $30 million in funding. So it's expanded to $84 million this year to upgrade bus fleets. And so I hope you will take the opportunity to apply. The deadline is fast approaching on June 18th. Following the APTA meeting in Atlanta, I had the opportunity to participate in the opening of the New Flyer Vehicle Innovation Center. And this approach to innovation and workforce training provided a way to educate the public and prepare our workforce to meet the demands of tomorrow. And it was very interactive in classrooms. They even had me driving a bus, believe it or not. I did crash it, so I won't be getting a CDL anytime soon, but I do believe they set me up. Where are they? But if you have similar initiatives in those areas, I would love to come and visit those. As I said, it's one of the Secretary's major priorities. And so when it comes to innovation, I'm everyone's biggest fan. So if you have something you want me to come and see that's unique and innovative, please let my staff know, because I would love to see it. Mobility on demand, that's one aspect of bus and paratransit services that has inspired this optimism. Our mobility on demand is about embracing transit's role as of a number of mobility options that individuals have in the near future. Many of them accessible by smartphones, which probably everyone seated in this room has one, and just 10 years ago, none of us did. So it's amazing to see the pace of technology. I'm so glad that transportation network companies have joined APTA too, and that they're a part of this larger conversation. One of the things I think I learned from listening to Nat is it's not about mode, it's about mobility. And so if we can all look at the industry as a way to get from point A to point B in the most efficient way possible, I think that serves us all very well. FTA's Mobility on Demand Sandbox, you probably are familiar with. There's $8 million in grants for 11 projects that are currently going on across the country. We expect to have a second round. I know I'm going to definitely get that question, so let me just let you know that second round will hopefully be coming soon. As you all know, automation holds the potential to improve public transportation services in ways we probably can't even imagine yet today. For not only the providers, but also the riders. It improves safety, flexibility of service, and the predictability of that service. As you know, we had 2 RFCs out earlier this year asking the industry for your input. I'm being briefed on that this week to find out exactly where the comments are in the industry and how we can be a help to the industry on how we innovate and continue that. We also just finished our STAR research plan, the Strategic Transit Automated Research Plan, which we like to refer to as STAR, which helps support not only the development but the deployment of automated bus transit at FTA, we have a unique ability to actually demonstrate how different technology works. And many of the other areas of DOT don't have that ability in their research budget. So that's what makes us a little different. You know, I've been talking a lot about the future, but to obtain that future, we must continue to invest in it. And so I'm pleased to announce that FTA is publishing the FY18 full year apportionments today on our website. In fact, I was told it went live at 3. Thank you. As you all know, FTA will allocate $13.4 billion in funding to support public transportation nationwide. And this represents an overall increase of 8% over 2017 levels. I need to tell you, it's the high watermark for FTA. We have never in our history been granted this level of funding. And so with that comes a lot of responsibility. And so in particular interest maybe to all of you is that there was a 78% increase in funding for Section 5339, the competitive bus program. This represents, in addition, there was a 50% increase in the formula bus program. So when you think of the state of good repair, I hope we're going to, which also saw an increase of 17%. I'm hopeful that when I was told more than a third of our bus fleets in the country need to be replaced in just the next few years, that this will help make a dent in that. We have funding in 5310 that increases to $274 million. And as you know, we just did the first round of bus and bus facilities grants. Those grants went out to 139 projects in 52 states and territories with $264 million in funding. And that funding was all of 17 along with our CR funding through 18. So we will have a second round. And that second round will be sometime this fall. We're working on the NOFO now to get that out as soon as possible. And so there'll be another $370 million in competitive bus and bus facilities infrastructure investment grants. So be sure to be looking for our NOFO so that you can get in on that funding. It's always such a pleasure for Henrika used to lead our TPM office, which does most of our grant making, and now she's moved over to safety, so her very capable deputy, Bruce Robinson, will have his hands full with all this new money and finding ways to spend it. But we're happy that we were able to do that. As you know, we've also continued to fund our small starts grant agreements in the Capital Investment Grant Program. The first in recently that we just did is in Kansas City, Missouri, to extend their BRT line. And it's going to serve their second busiest corridor in their area. So they were very excited about that. And we were also able to fund a project in Everett, Washington, another BRT project for SWIFT 2. And that'll help connect major employment centers with residential areas. So both of those were, we were very happy to get that funding out the door. And in addition to these levels of funding, we also have our innovative coordinated access and mobility grants. And they are critical in improving public transportation options that increase access to healthcare for individuals that don't have any transportation. And so we'll be conducting, our staff, I guess, is going to be conducting a special session here on Wednesday to provide further information on that funding. FTA's investments will allow Americans to have a greater choice and a greater independence, which has a positive impact on the economy by connecting people to jobs, to businesses, businesses to employees, and commerce with customers. Transit isn't the only area in which significant infrastructure investment is needed. Much of America's investment in infrastructure is necessary. Much of it is in a state of disrepair. And this administration has a program to fix it. To address this, the nation's infrastructure needs, the administration earlier this year released the President's Initiative for Rebuilding Infrastructure in America. And this plan, as many have referred to it as the infrastructure plan, provides $200 billion in federal funding over the next 10 years to spur at least $1.5 trillion in infrastructure investments across the country. The President Infrastructure Plan addresses the transit industry in 3 major ways. First, it is with value capture financing as a condition of receipt of the transit funds for capital investment grants. This excludes small starts, And historically, it's been small starts that have supported BRT projects, for example. So this requirement is likely to affect the larger projects, the new starts and the core capacity projects. Nonetheless, we believe value capture is a creative way to get projects funded, get them funded more quickly, and allows us to cover more areas with greater investment. The second transit-specific provision of the infrastructure plan is eliminating constraints on the use of P3s, or public-private partnerships. We're working on that along with the expedited project delivery program. We've already had 2 different agencies come in and want to be the first to use that expedited pilot delivery. And what is unique about that is in the statute, it actually says 25%, or in the program initially, it was 25% federal investment. And yet, even though we want to drive down federal investment to leverage it greater, this actually has increased to 50%. And so we've had 2 different transit agencies come in wanting to be the first to actually grab that new money. So we're looking forward to actually working with all of you to get those out the door. As I mentioned earlier, one of Secretary Chow's priorities is innovation, but when it comes to preparing for the future, innovation goes hand in hand with regulatory reform. What's great about the future is that it allows you to learn from and correct the mistakes of the past. For decades, we've seen unnecessary and burdensome regulations increase the time it takes to get critical projects started and finished. And so we have a hope of rebuilding our infrastructure and accommodating future demand. We cannot continue to be bogged down by red tape. I'm proud to say that this administration is getting results. As President Trump announced in his State of the Union address, and I quote, "In our drive to make Washington accountable, we have eliminated more regulations in our first year than any administration in history," end quote. As a former Reagan Schedule C, I didn't think anyone could surpass his deregulatory efforts, but this administration has in only its first year. He believes we're only halfway there, so stay tuned, there'll be more to come. Our administration's commitment to reducing and eliminating unnecessary rules and regulations is really unprecedented, and Secretary Chow has continued to challenge each of the modal administrators to find ways to allow us to do our job, but to do it in a way that does not hinder industry and does not hinder innovation, to be efficient. And so many of you already are benefiting from some of our focus in that area. In the first quarter of this year, for example, we reduced reports by 37%, eliminating more than 4,300 reports. We've done that by allowing grantees that have $2 million or less projects to report only once a year, not 4 times a year. This has eliminated close to 12,000 reports and saving grant recipients over 90,000 staff hours. That simple change will reduce the number of grants subject to quarterly reporting by 44%. So as we move into the promising future, it is paramount that it be a safe one. Safety is FTA's #1 priority, as it is the Secretary's, and I'm sure it's yours as well. Our efforts have been focused mainly on rail transit safety. However, last year we began a concerted effort to educate everyone in the transit industry that all transit grants, bus and rail in rural and urban areas, are at risk if states are late in setting up their required state safety oversight program. This applies to 30 states that have rail transit systems across America, but you can see it impacts everyone. These states have to establish a state safety oversight program and have it certified by FTA no later than April 15th of 2019. Otherwise, FTA will be prohibited by law from obligating any new funds in that state. So regardless if you're a bus or paratransit, if you have rail in your state, your funding is subjected to it as well. So to date, I'm proud to say, we have 11 states that have been certified by FTA, with several more expected in the coming months and weeks. We continue to partner with each of the remaining states to ensure everyone makes it across the finish line. Our intent is that everyone meet that deadline and that no funding is withheld from any state. In closing, I'd like to take this opportunity to update you on the status of FTA's emergency relief funding. As many of you know, this is a topic that is very important to me, as I was sworn in at FTA mere days before Hurricane Harvey struck the Gulf Coast. It made for Quite an interesting first week, to say the least. And then Hurricanes Irma and Maria struck, devastating Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and causing major damage here in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Thankfully, here in Tampa, the damage was not as bad as we had feared it might be. I recall my phone call with then CEO Catherine Egan as Hart in Tampa, days before the storm made landfall, asking how could we be of help. She was a little taken aback that somebody from the FTA in Washington was calling, and they were calling to offer help. But as a result of that just short phone call, FTA was able to reach out and get an $11 million grant expedited through the Department of Labor. In fact, that was one of Yvette Taylor's. I called her about 10:30 at night when I was leaving the department and said, is there anything we can do to help move this along? They're running out of money. And she said, well, let me make a call. They've only had it a week, but I'll see what I can do. And we had it done in about 24 hours and got that to Hart in Tampa. And so we're very proud of that. And those are the types of things we try to do at FTA, that we want to be your partner. We want to be able to help. And so throughout these storms, FTA headquarters and regional staff that were working to assist the agencies and to prepare and really recover and assess the damage, it gave me an opportunity to really learn my staff and get to know them, not only at FTA, but at the department. It also gave me the opportunity to meet many of you and have personal phone calls with each of you to ask how we could be helpful, and we continue that relationship today. We've heard from 114 transit agencies that sustained damage related to the storms, and at this point, approximately $70 million in damages has been related to buses and bus facilities, with an additional $35 million in emergency operations, including evacuations, which is almost entirely attributable to bus and paratransit service. The good news is, based on what we know today, we believe Congress has provided adequate funding to cover those claims, and so look for those allocations to be published very soon. Many have remarked over the past few months about how difficult my start was at FTA. After all, in addition to 3 major hurricanes, there were also the wildfires in California. But what I told them then, and what I will tell you all now, is that, in fact, the opposite was actually true. From my very first week, I had the opportunity to see firsthand what an extraordinary organization I have privileged to lead, and one full of dedicated professionals with a passion for not only public transportation, but for public service. In addition, I got to know many of you. One of my first calls was to Nat. I got to see all of you in action during an incredibly difficult time in your leadership, and I want you to know that it was clear America depended on you. And those who operate bus and paratransit services, you were their lifeline. And you continue to be that today. Day in and day out, you help people get to work, to school, to the doctors, to shopping, and all of life's many opportunities. And in an emergency, bus and paratransit service literally save lives. It's not something, thankfully, you're called to do every day, but when the hurricane approaches, or the wildfire threatens, or the blizzard paralyzes, no one can do what you do. You are simply irreplaceable. Thank you for your bravery and for your professionalism. Even while many of your own homes and families were in danger and displaced, you continued to serve your community. On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your service. I look forward to answering your questions.
Acting Administrator Williams. Joining us now are Henrika Buchanan, and she's the FTA Associate Administrator for Program Management, and Yvette Taylor, FTA Regional Administrator for Region 4, my former region. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you can sit on my side.
Okay. Well, first, thank you. I think a lot of us really appreciate the remarks, and hearing your perspective. FTA really coming to the table as a partner, I think, is really welcome to our ears. That's great, and the open partnership. There's a lot of exciting projects, a lot of exciting grants that are coming out, some great increases that are happening, and especially the increase in the omnibus spending bill allocating $13.4 billion for public transit, a great win for everybody in this room. I'm going to touch on one that I'm particularly interested in, so I'll take a personal approach here. So, there was the recently published notice of funding opportunity for the Tiger program, now renamed BUILD. I got to get it right. Better utilizing investments to leverage development. And so we'll all get that in our heads, right? And so funding for that program has increased $500 million. And so that's been a fantastic program to really leverage private investment. Could you talk a bit about the BUILD program and kind of what you're looking for, the process for those seeking grants? Are there any particular things that you're looking for as part of that program for what a winning recipient might gear their application towards?
As in the Tiger grants, the BUILD grants will follow a similar approach. I think we're always looking to try to leverage as much of the federal investment as we can. And we also look at individual projects for geographical distribution. I know we sustained some criticism for that. But in looking at what projects were funded, I know in transit we were disappointed in what was funded. And quite frankly, I'm hoping that the next round will be different. But those projects that come in, they have to be able to compete with other projects in rural America, in highways, in maritime, in rail. The capital investment grant program is one of the most oversubscribed there is, and yet BUILD, or otherwise known as Tiger, or earlier known as Tiger, is even more so. So it's highly competitive. And we are hopeful that we will have a better outcome. We did do better than I think we were given credit for, in that many of the projects were streetscapes. So they included actual transit situations and things in the actual grant itself, but it wasn't considered a purely transit grant. And so if it was a complete streetscape, it was not necessarily given any credit for having transit components to it. So we did actually do a little better than I think many realize, but certainly we want to do better.
Any other comments?
Just to follow up a little bit, I would say that I think the administration has been clear about where the priorities lie, and I actually think to sort of echo Jane, that transit is uniquely situated to be able to take advantage of some of that. So I think we've heard loud and clear that value capture is something that's important. The program has been renamed to talk about leveraging development. So I do think it's about how you leverage the federal dollar to really bring additional resources to the table, but also show how you're really changing the landscape or the economic opportunity of your community. And so I think pretty consistently, we've seen the administration really speak to those type of principles, and I think transit can step up to that message and really be effective and show how transit projects in particular, do just that.
Sure. Yeah, you're exactly right.
So I'll switch gears a little here and talk a bit about the new mobility paradigm. Acting Administrator Williams, in your opening remarks, you talked a bit about the future and being prepared for the future and helping transit agencies. So in that vein, when we talk about mobility changing and the rapid change that we're seeing not only at individual transit agencies but industry-wide, and it's transforming the traditional methods that we have been accustomed of providing the services to our customers. APTA has programs, the Sandbox program, you mentioned that, there'll be another round. And we definitely appreciate FTA's investment in this area. But the question really is, what do you see as the future role for FTA in supporting the workforce that's associated with this changing, paradigm in this mobility era? So we'd like to hear a bit about what role do you see FTA playing in this workforce development that's going to be required?
I know that is something Vince in our TRI office, our research office, is looking at, and the request for comments look at that as well. I think, it is a changing workforce, and, we will have to change with it. What it will look like is difficult to know because technology continues to move so quickly, and we don't want to pick winners and losers. We want kind of the market to dictate that technology, but I think where we can grow at FTA is getting that information out. What I heard at APTA Ledge was some in the bus community that were using electrical buses that had issues with different things and different components, they had no idea that there were other agencies that were having similar issues, and they had been struggling with it for a long time. And so if we can help try to be a clearinghouse for that kind of information so that people can have access to it, if there's a place to go to say, oh, they had the same situation happen here, I would look for that in the workforce as well, as we see how it will change it. I mean, smartphones have changed everyone's life. I mean, how many times have you gone out of the house and you go, okay, where's my phone? Now I have to say, where are both my phones? Because now I have two. And so now I have it takes me twice as long to get out of the house because I'm looking for both of them most of the time. So if you just think about it in that context, I mean, it has changed, but I think, as it changes, and how APTA can be helpful with that too is the retraining and whatnot. In fact, I've met with some of APTA's folks that are in that area, asking how can we be a catalyst to preparing. The secretary is the former secretary of the Department of Labor. She served all 8 years at the Labor Department for George W. Bush, so she cares a lot about the impact it has on the workforce and how we prepare that workforce for tomorrow.
I would just say the industry shouldn't forget that with the FAST Act, there was some new eligibility as it relates to your ability to train, right? So prior to the FAST Act, I think there was like a 0.5% of your formula money, specifically 5307 money, that could be used toward NTI type courses. And the FAST Act really expanded that across our formula programs, but it also expanded the eligibility. So it made training an eligible component from a grant standpoint. And one of the things that we did in our early bus competition was really to emphasize that we said we were going to give priorities to proposals that utilize that 0.5%. And the reason we did that is because as new technologies emerge, that means there's new training needs from a workforce standpoint. So from an eligibility standpoint, the FAST Act created opportunity for some of the training to be there. And as the market changes, the industry will figure out how to respond to that.
So we have questions, but I also want to remind the audience, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please walk up to the mic and then we will recognize you. Otherwise, we'll continue with our prepared questions. So please make your way forward if you have any questions. Acting Administrator Williams, you also mentioned the regulatory reforms and being more efficient with the way we have our policies, implement programs. So a question we have is, what impact do you anticipate that having these new reforms, especially when we looked at the new regulatory efficiencies in the programs? So recently, the Trump administration announced an effort to coordinate the environmental reviews and accelerate the delivery of major infrastructure projects. And you spoke a bit about that in your opening comments. What impacts do you anticipate that this will have on the development of transit infrastructure projects, as well as what advice do you have on how we can take full advantage of these new opportunities to explore greater regulatory efficiencies in the future? So not just what we've, you did say there's a coming attraction, there'll be more to come later, but how can we take advantage and be more proactive as it relates to regulatory efficiencies?
Well, I'm proud to say that this administration, for every one rule promulgated, 23 have been rescinded. And that's unprecedented, simply unprecedented under any administration. And so we've been challenged to continue that, which, we picked the low-hanging fruit first. And so it will be more difficult to do that, but we're continuing to be challenged to do so. At FTA, we just did our performance review, and we actually, for every one rule we put in, 3 have come out, which I'm happy about for FTA. The one record of decision, why that is so important is right now with environmental work, no one owns it. And so it kind of goes from agency to agency to agency to agency. And so when no one has ownership of it, I can send it to Henrika at EPA, and then Henrika sends it back to me, and she's got comments, and then I try to fix those. I send them back to her, and then she sends it to the Corps, and then the Corps has comments, and they got to send it back to her. And nobody has ownership of the process. We will have ownership of the process. There will be one lead federal department, and that department will be held accountable to meet that 2-year deadline. One of the things the president talked about in his State of the Union was trying to understand why it takes us so long to deliver a project today. when, you know, they could deliver the Empire State Building in a year, and we can't deliver a simple road in 10. Simply something has gone wrong, and how do we fix it? And so we're trying to recalibrate, knowing that that's going to be a challenge for many to meet those deadlines. But there are consequences if you don't. And so I think it's going to really get project delivery so much faster, and I think that can attract a lot more private investment. When you think about investing in a transit project that may take you 10 or 15 years to bring to fruition, nobody in the private industry really is interested. And so if you can tell them, no, we're actually ready to move forward and we can deliver a project in half that time, I think it'll change the trajectory of the private investment.
And one of the things I like to add from an operational perspective, particularly in environmental reviews, this is an area where you all can help us, our grantees, is that as you're contemplating your transit projects, to contact your regional office up front early so we can work with you in helping to determine the appropriate actions. I know we've expanded projects that can fall now under categorical exclusions, and so let's take advantage of those benefits. But I think one of the key factors in that particular area, we can expedite a lot if we just start to communicate early on and try to move through the process quicker.
I want to jump back to something that we talked about earlier, technology. You talked about the two phones, right? And I think a lot of us in the room find ourselves in this situation a little too frequently, right? And so, you know, this idea of mobility management and technical innovation and smartphones, they really kind of go hand in hand. So just a couple questions kind of related to that topic. So one, you know, you're finding that issues such as automation, electrification, things like that are crossing these modal boundaries. And you know, in addition, how is this really changing the relationship with USDOT, within USDOT, such as your relationship with National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Federal Highway Administration? You know, we're sitting here, and a big focus of this conference has been, you know, this changing mobility paradigm. And you know, I think the general question is, you know, how is this being approached from a USDOT perspective and relationships with other federal agencies and folks really working together to advance where I think we all see it going?
The Secretary has been very clear that we are one DOT, and so we have worked really hard to harmonize many of our regulations. We do already a lot with Federal Highway, and we do some with FRA. We're doing even more now. You know, I work very closely with them. I see the NHTSA. We are going to have a new NHTSA administrator who's my deputy now, who is, I think has her confirmation hearing next week. I work very closely with her and also with the highway deputy as well. And so we look at trying to harmonize things. We don't want it to be confusing for the industry. To, you know, you come in and you have one, you know, regulation that's with FRA that's sort of slightly different than what FTA requires, which is even different than what the highway requires. And so when you have an agency that crosses across all of those lines, it becomes very confusing. And so we're really working to harmonize those and to speak as one DOT.
So you also mentioned in your opening remarks safety and the state safety oversight, and that the transit agencies are going to be required to become certified. And you shared your desire to make sure that everybody receives this certification. So a question is, how can transit agencies reach out to you for help? Those who are struggling and have questions or need additional assistance, how can you help them to ensure that they do get this certification?
Well, so this has been kind of one of the first things I took on under my leadership, was to get this done. I was at MDOT when we had our funds withheld, so it's sort of a sore spot for me, as Kevin knows. But you know, trying to not have an adversarial approach, but a partnership approach was something that I wanted to bring to the table. I wrote on the Maryland side with Kevin Rygert the Metro Rail Safety Commission legislation for Maryland. It had to be exactly the same as the legislation in the Commonwealth of Virginia and the District of Columbia. You couldn't find three more diverse areas of the country, and yet we had to make that happen, and we did. And so my approach has been, if we can do that, we can get anybody else over the finish line, because it was and is the most complex compact that we currently have to operate within in the transit community. And so I want to work with people. I do not want to be in the chair calling a state saying, by the way, you're not getting any of your funding until this is, you know, your state is certified. So we've reached out to governors, we've reached out to the state program, and this lady has taken on safety now, and so she is our chief safety officer, and part of her responsibilities is to help get everyone over the finish line. And so we have her staff that have worked with each of the different states. So we have 11 that have crossed the finish line. I have 1 or 2 that are pretty close to being ready, and probably another 7 or 8 that are under review. And so we're making a lot of progress, but I have no ability to change that date of April 15th of 2019. It's in law and in statute, so I don't have the ability to change it or to waive it or to delay it or anything. So, you know, whatever we can do, they can reach out to my office directly, they can reach out to Henrika Buchanan and her staff directly. We do workshops. In fact, we have an SSOA meeting coming up, a workshop on the 15th of May, and so I'll be speaking at that. We've really tried to make this, everywhere I speak, I mention it, and sometimes my speechwriter said, "What, you know, do you want to really include that again?" I said, yes. They're like, "But they're not safety professionals that'll really be there." I said, "I don't care. You know, you all are not," but they said, "Well, why are you even bringing this up? They don't do rail. This is bus and paratransit." I said, "Because it impacts them too. If your rail transit agency doesn't get this stood up, it's going to impact your bus and bus facilities and your paratransit services." So it's really important that everybody, you never know who's in the audience that can go back and make a phone call and say, in fact, I met someone at SWATA who came up to me and said, "Yeah, I talked to this state. They had no idea that they were really behind until they saw your chart, and I showed them, and they said, 'Oh, we're really behind.'" And so he had a whole conversation with them just simply because they were at the same conference. I spoke about it. He had the chart. He shared it with them. They had no idea that they were behind the 8 ball when, in fact, they were, and they've made a lot of progress since that day. So we do everything we can, but it's like everything else, you know, it has to come from the state. But my commitment is that we will not be, we will not be looking to put up roadblocks. We want to reach across and help you get there. You got to get the information to us. We've got to comply with our regulations and the law, but we want to help you do that. And so whatever we can do to help, we're willing to do.
Thank you.
Just following up, I'll say, you know, sitting here, when Jane took over the agency, we were in a different place than where we are now. And what I will say, I think it was at APTA annual last year where we announced maybe the first state that we've certified. And really over the last 6 months, the industry has come a long way. As Jane mentioned, we've certified 11 states to date. We actually have another 14 applications in hand, which really leaves us with only 6 states where we're waiting for them to submit their application. Of those 6, I know that 3 will have theirs in by September, which is the date in which we said, actually 4, that we need to get it in order to be able to verify, to say that we can assure you that we would get it reviewed before the deadline. There are 2 that we'll be working with to help them get over the finish line. But we're sitting here today in a much better place than the industry was 6 months ago. A large part of that is because of the message that keeps coming out and the leadership that Administrator Williams has had. So I do have a big charge in terms of making sure that this year's $13.4 billion continues to flow to the states. But I think that we've got a process in place. We're working with the states on a monthly basis. We're reaching out. At this point, every state has legislation. Of the 6 that we're waiting on, they're all in our stage 3, which means they're about to be able to knock on our door. So we're sitting here today in a much better place than we were 6 months ago or even 2 months ago. So I'm optimistic that we will keep our foot on the gas, but we will cross the finish line.
Okay. And the takeaway is, if you need help, reach out.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
we're here to help. No one wants to, I mean, first of all, safety is our #1 priority, and the reason we're certified under a new framework is because we think we need to make some of the systems safer, so we are committed to giving you the technical assistance that we need to get over the door.
Thank you.
One other brief point that Henrika actually mentioned is we had asked everyone to get them in by April of this year. So we had 1 year out. Everybody sort of, I think, had that as their goal. Many have made it, some haven't, and we're working with them. But just know that if you get it in after September, the chances of us, we can't guarantee you that we can certify it. And I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but if we have all 6 that we're still waiting to review come in at the end of December, trying to get everybody done is going to be difficult. It's an iterative process, so you may submit your application and we see that there's 3 or 4 things that we still need and that are missing that we have to get and you have to provide. And so it's not just like you submit it, we review it, and it's done. So I want to make sure, I had to manage everybody's expectations in Maryland because we want to have a big party when we finally got the legislation passed. It was a huge and heavy lift, but I had to explain to them that that was just the first step and not the last one. And so I would let you know that, getting those in as soon as you can gives you a better chance of making sure you cross that finish line.
That's
You
great.
have a question, David?
Hi, my name is David Leard with HDR Engineering, and since you were talking about smartphones and technology, and you mentioned the apportionments have come out, I opened up one of the apportionments because I've been working on the Albuquerque Rapid Transit Project, and I noticed when I opened up the CIG funding that there was apportionments, and it says for the previous full funding grant agreement commitments, but there were no other apportionments that show up, and I was wondering if that was because it hadn't updated yet, or because the 1.2, it's like 1.2 billion in unapportioned was still hanging out. So is FTA planning to allocate that money down the road for projects like Albuquerque and other small starts, for example?
Yes, absolutely. So we understand, even though we did a partial apportionment when we have to have 5/12 of funding. So we did it, I think, at about 6/12 of our funding. I understand that folks don't want to come in and ask for their grant and their money until they have a full year appropriation. So we didn't want to wait. We wanted to get that money out and accessible to the states. That being said, the 18 omnibus had some complex language in it, and it's still being reviewed. And so we weren't really ready to say, here's how we're going to allocate the rest of the money. That doesn't mean to say that we won't, because we will, but we have a deadline of the end of 2019 to do so. And so we want to make sure it is one of the most complicated arrangements. We have, I used to work in Congress, and I worked for an appropriator to have House language and Senate language from the appropriations committees that are different and they're incongruent. And then you have the summary report, the explanatory statement that is supposed to trump all of that, no pun intended. It gets kind of confusing is when you're trying to lay out how they want you to do this. And so we have made a commitment. In fact, I made a commitment, it was about a little over a week ago, to Congress when I went up and testified on the appropriations bill, and said that we intend to allocate the money in accordance with the law, and we'll continue to do that. We'll continue to process the projects through the program like we have, and we'll look at each of their individual merits. And Albuquerque is one of those small star projects that received part of their funding in 17, and of course with the additional 18 appropriations would likely receive the remainder. I know that we've worked a lot with Albuquerque and some of the issues that you've had there, and so that's something that is nearing completion of my review, and so we're hopeful that that one will be coming soon.
Great, thank you.
I'll jump to similar but different topic of big data. And so big data, this sort of term that's thrown out there is really seen sort of as this new oil rush, right? Suddenly there's all this data available, and it's something that I know at MTA in Baltimore, we're getting all this data in and trying to parse through what's useful, and even something that we talked about at the APTA Board of Directors meeting, one of the real priority initiatives of APTA Chair Nat Ford is really aggressively pursuing opportunities for leveraging transit's big data, strengthening decision making, really measuring performance, better understanding, better serving our customers, better serving our communities. Can you share anything about FTA's initiatives in this arena, or and maybe a different take on is if there's a role to play, or what role FTA can play with big data, and kind of where you see yourselves in that arena?
I could step in on that one. So what I will say is, so I'm going to start first as the Chief Safety Officer,
Sure.
right? So
Yeah.
one of the things that we're working at from a safety perspective is really looking at what type of safety data do we need in terms of decision making? And so we have a whole effort in terms of how we integrate our safety data into maybe like our NTD or our systems to make sure that we're getting the data that we need, but also that what are the protections that we need in terms of being able to get some of that data. There's been some conversations about like risk-based inspections, and so we've talked about, even from a data perspective with that, if state safety agencies were going to have a risk-based perspective inspection program, what type of data would be necessary in order to be able to, what type of hazard data would be necessary, and then how would we be able to protect that? Just switching to an agency standpoint, there are conversations around, making sure that in the NTD, that the data we collect is data that we're using, and how do we tell our story from a transit performance standpoint based on the data that we have in NTD. And from time to time, we're called upon to use that data in different ways to be able to really say what transit's benefit may be for a community. And Jane and I just had a conversation, I think it was Friday, where we were talking about even the different software platforms that are out there now that can help you aggregate data in a way that it really creates a community profile. And so those are conversations that we're having about making sure that the data we collect is data that's useful, that we're getting the right data, but also with the data that we have, how can we better utilize it to tell a community story, and what tools are out there in the industry to be able to help us do that. And so we're having some early conversations about that, so I'm not shocked that it's also something that communities are thinking about as you talk about decision making. I think it's October or somewhere in that time when somebody else may know better, the asset management plans are due. But all of that is going to create data that's going to be useful in terms of making investment decisions on a local level. So it's really stepping back and making sure that we are deliberate about the data that we get and how we use it to inform our decision-making process.
One of the things I'd have to just say to the industry that I found incredibly helpful when you come in to meet with me on the different impacts you can show based on what you are advocating for. So if you're advocating for a project, how that project impacts not just that community, but where those rail cars you're buying for the project and where the different components are actually manufactured and the jobs they represent is incredibly helpful. So I'd ask you to continue to do those things.
And I think what we can also be helpful is that we do have a national transit database, right? So we do have a big compository of data, and it's making sure that the data we have is a data that's going to be useful to the industry. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? So is there a way that we can leverage the systems we have to be able to use data in the most appropriate way?
That's good.
Just want to make another announcement that we have time for a couple more questions from the audience, if anyone has. Please.
My name is Holmes Hummel with Clean Energy Works. Since we had this bus conference last year, about 400 mayors have signed on through the U.S. Conference of Mayors to advance their own carbon pledges within their city metropolitan areas. It seems that that would put them in a position to eliminate fossil fuels in their bus fleets by 2030 or so. Some of them will still have fossil fuel buses in their fleet that haven't exhausted their 12-year life by that point. Has FTA discussed what the implications are for this federal policy that requires the 12-year life of the diesel buses that are in service or being ordered this year, and the countercurrent of local policies that are moving in a different direction?
You know, I haven't quite heard it that way. What I typically hear from areas are that as they ramp up to more cleaner fuel vehicles is how they balance investment in some of the clean diesel versus some of the new technologies like the electric, to make sure that they have, they're taking a more holistic view to their fleets. I haven't really had agencies come in and say that they want to completely replace their clean diesel fleets with a different source all at once. They're generally trying to do some type of phased approach, just from the fact that there's not enough money out there to do it in that way. So with that being said, I don't know that we've looked at the useful life policy against clean energy policies, because it's not an issue that's really been raised to us at that point.
With the deepest respect for FTA, APTA has many different conferences, including the Sustainability Committee's workshop, which will be in Vancouver this summer. But last summer, it was in Minneapolis. And one of the cities that has an all-electric bus fleet today did try to find contacts at FTA at that workshop to ask what to do with his fossil fuel vehicles that were in a parking lot that he had to continue to make payments on under the regulation. So the Sustainability Committee members of APTA are already grappling with that issue out on the ground. I'm sure we can continue the conversation afterward, but thank you for
Yeah, that's
recognizing
interesting.
it.
Make sure that they first always start with their regional office, and we will.
Well, let me just make a comment, because I think your question is in terms of disposing of those vehicles before they reach their useful life and the federal interest that is in that vehicle. So currently, as of today, there's no relief from that, but there are options. So our policy gives us a number of options of how those vehicles could possibly be disposed of without necessarily paying back the federal interest to FTA, but perhaps you could roll the federal interest into one of the new, better technology buses is an option, but there are a series of options, and the regional office would be more than happy to work with the grantee on what those options are.
Thank you. There's a question in the back.
Hello. Hi. Gary Rosenthal with the Memphis Transit Authority, and I would just like to thank you all for being here and being presenting today. And a word to the room, they are serious about their desire to help us. Dr. Taylor, thank you for Region 4's efforts in helping us get our trolley system back up and running, which started last Monday. Yay. And Ms. Williams, you've been more than gracious in welcoming to your office our visits to Washington. But I would like to get your thoughts on how we can help the FTA. There are some areas where there are some conflicting goals between policies, conflicting objectives, and it does make it difficult. The depreciation issue that the gentleman just talked about is one of those things, not just from a federal recapitalization of another project aspect, but the calculation of what it means for useful life and used life as compared to the age of the vehicle. But how can we help you to identify where these problems are that we see in the field that become frustrating and costly to the agencies in the field?
We'll certainly raise that with our regional office first. That's how it's the quickest to get to me, is through our regions. We have, every 2 weeks, we have an EMT call with all of them on the Jumbotron, as I like to refer to it. They also do weekly reports to me. I'm in touch with most of them. I've talked to at least a couple times a week, just because they give me a call on a specific issue. So if there's something that you feel that we need to do, that's your best obvious way to get to me quickest. Obviously, if you're in town, I'm always willing to meet with folks that are in from out of town. I try to have a very open door policy, even to the chagrin of my staff. You know, many of you I've met with multiple times, but I feel like that's important, and my role is to listen. And so if there's, you know, some policy that we need to look at as far as the usefulness, the useful life of a bus, then that's something we can certainly take back and work on and see what we can come up with. But we're always willing to be collaborative where we can.
Right, and I'd just like to add to that as well, Jane. If it is a cross-cutting issue, policy issue that many of you are facing, it would be good to sort of capture that as a group. I know we have our one-on-one conversations, the regions, with our respective grantees, but if it seems like it's overarching, I don't know the best way, if it's like through an APTA or through white paper perhaps. And I would also suggest that when you raise the issue, always maybe have a recommendation as to how you think that issue could be addressed. That would be very helpful.
Sure, and it's one of those types of things where an asset portion regulation is in conflict with an asset management or a maintenance portion of the regulation. Yeah, it's not something that it's just hey, here's this harebrained idea. It's where you see these conflicts. that force us into inefficiencies as compared to efficiencies. And that's what I would like to help. Personally, I would like to help fix that because it has an effect on my agency, but also it has an effect on everybody here. So I appreciate the response and look forward to that opportunity.
Right, so one of the things I need to make sure that so generally when we do, whether it's a guidance document, whether it's a regulation, anything that has a binding obligation, we go through a notice and comment period. So part of what we would hope that we would get from the industry is where you see those conflicts in those documents, that you comment to the docket so that we can consider that as we promulgate our handbooks and our regulations. Now, and if we don't catch it at that point, that is why we are often engaged with APTA, why we engage with AASHTO, why we engage with CTAA, because as the industry, we like to hear where the implementation issues are so that we can take that back and revise our procedures.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think with that, with that question, I think we might close up. I think it's a great question that talks about open dialogue, open communication between all the parties, I think, and so we're all responsible for that, and that's to all the success for all of us here in the room. And so with that, why don't we take a moment and thank Acting Administrator Williams and her staff for joining us here today.
We also would like to thank the audience for attending this session. We heard great comments. We covered a lot of topics, and the takeaway is reach out to your regional office if you have questions. They're here to help you, and they want to see us be successful. So thank you again for coming out and participating. And a reminder, tomorrow morning we start at 8 a.m. the general session in this room on big data. So see you tomorrow morning at 8.
Right now.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.